Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Melissa Marchand, Marla's Communication Director, and it's our pleasure to have you on today's Cuba Outlook 2018 webinar. Okay, let's get started. Again, thank you and welcome, everyone. It's our pleasure to have you on today's Cuba Outlook 2018 webinar. Before I introduce my panelists, I do want to communicate to you that Marla Dukran has asked me to step in for her today. She had an unforeseen family emergency that she's dealing with right now, and that's exactly where she needs to be with her family. So we do appreciate your understanding, and of course, I'm going to make sure that you get what you came for today. We have two fantastic panelists lined up. The fella in the center of your screens, who you cannot see, not because he's in a dark room, but because he does not have a video cam available today to take this call, is Jaime Reusche from Moody's. Moody's produces an annual credit analysis report on Cuba, and they've recently changed their outlook from positive to stable, so hopefully we'll hear some information about that. Jaime is key in producing that analysis. He and his team does that, and so he will speak to us today a lot on the outlook and economic matters. The other person that we have today is David Jessop. David is the editor of Cuba Briefing, which is a Caribbean Council weekly publication and analysis on Cuba. David has been doing this for many, many years and is one of the leading experts in the world on Cuba from the standpoint of political and policy outlook. So it's going to be a very great conversation. We have a wonderful panel lined up for you today. I also just wanted to remind you that we will have a brief Q&A session, so you can submit questions through the questions box. And gentlemen, let's go ahead and get started and have some fun. Jaime, I'd like to start off with you. Just having you talk to us a little bit about why growth in Cuba has been so slow. What's causing it? What's causing the economy to underperform its targets? Go ahead and take the mic and just let us hear some of your thoughts, Jaime.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Melissa said, we have been watching Cuba closely over the past few years. There was quite a bit of excitement about Cuba in recent years after President Obama began the rapprochement process. But since then, things have been hitting a bit of a wall. And most of the reason that you've seen a significant slowdown in economic growth, despite a relatively favorable tourism story and a relatively favorable visitor arrival story, because we call people coming to visit from the U.S. visitors, because of still regulations that are in place and that prevent actual tourism into Cuba. But nonetheless, that has been a bright spot of the Cuban economy, where what has helped derail or has actually been negative in terms of economic performance have been natural disasters. And the past 2 years, Cuba has been hit twice by major hurricanes. In 2016, it was Hurricane Matthew that struck mostly the eastern half of the island. And then in 2017, it was Hurricane Irma that hit the western half of the island. So what we are seeing is an interruption in economic activity in both years during the summer months and the tail end of the year, despite still some tourism activity going on. And to some degree, you would expect to see more increased economic activity from reconstruction efforts going forward. Those, of course, in 2017 were interrupted because of the hurricane. In 2018, we do expect to see a bit of a quickening of economic activity, particularly in the construction sector, because of the reconstruction of now both hurricanes. So barring another natural disaster event, you should see a quickening of economic growth. But then again, you also have another negative that has been playing on Cuba's economy, which has been the Venezuela story, which I'm sure we'll go into in the discussion. But indeed, you're seeing Cuba receive much less support from Venezuela, not just financial support, but also trade support. Venezuela going through its own crisis, In Cuba, as the title suggests, potentially going into another special period. This is something that Melissa teased as a potential theme here, and it seems very relevant. Cuba has always, throughout most of its history, relied on some foreign power to aid it. In the past, it used to be the United States, and then, of course, once they had their Cuban Revolution, they were very much dependent on the Soviet Union. When that fell apart, then they were pretty much in limbo and entered that special period until Venezuela came to pretty much support them and once again depend on them. Now that the Venezuelan support is going away and the Cubans understood this and they knew this, they started that process of rapprochement to once again come full circle and depend on the U.S., but that also is not playing out. So is a special period in the cards, despite a marginal quickening of economic activity. We're talking very low economic levels of economic growth in recent years and into the future, perhaps not even surpassing 2% growth in an economy with very significant development and infrastructure needs. So that 2% perhaps is not enough to help in its transition away from depending on other foreign powers. Is it enough for to demand another special period? I think that's the topic for the discussion.
Jaime, I'd like to have you go a little bit deeper into a few things related to Venezuela, because it's obviously very relevant to the discussion and to the economic performance of Cuba. I remember the downgrade, I think it was in 2014, that was one of that was the root of the downgrade, essentially, was the lower aid coming from Venezuela and what that implied for Cuba. Now, I don't know what types of numbers you have, but from a feasibility standpoint, there was a report and this is not a Venezuela webinar. I don't want to spend too much time on Venezuela, but I do find it to be very relevant. There's a report that came out yesterday that said that between 2016 and 2017, the percentage of Venezuelans in poverty moved from 82 to 87%, and in extreme poverty moved from 51% to 61% last year. That all happened last year. 64% of the Venezuelan population lost an average of 11.4 kilos in body weight. That's 25 pounds during 2017 as a result of hunger. And that comes after the prior year that 73% had lost 8.7 kilos, which is 19 pounds. So Venezuela is a country where 2/3 of the population has lost 45 pounds of body weight in the last 2 years. How feasible is it at all that they can send anything to Cuba right now? And I even pay for Cuban doctors. And what are the implications of this? I'm keeping in mind that a Venezuelan doctor costs the Venezuelan state about $1.50 a month. So what does this look like? What is the end of aid from Venezuela? What could that actually mean for Cuba? Could you just speak a little bit more on that?
Sure. We had been seeing, and you're right, Melissa, in the sense that in 2014 we downgraded Cuba's rating from CAA1 to CAA2, which is very low in our scale. There's only 3 more rating levels below that, which are highly, highly distressed sovereigns. In fact, Venezuela is now rated CAA3, which is 1 notch below Cuba, despite its vast oil wealth. But indeed, we were starting to see the beginnings of a cut in the Cuban aid, in the aid to Cuba starting in 2014, and we thought that Cuba was going to have trouble adjusting to that cut in aid. Remember that this was before the December 2014 announcement that the U.S. and Cuba were initiating a rapprochement process. So reacting to that fact, we downgraded the Cuban rating to CAA2 in 2015, once the rapprochement process had gotten going. We were seeing that potentially the U.S. could replace Venezuela as the source of not exactly aid, but as a new potential source of investment, of tourism, of commerce. So that's what that positive outlook was speaking to. And now that it has derailed, we've eliminated that. But indeed, Venezuela's situation is quite tragic. They are having significant challenges challenges reminiscent of 1980s Latin America, something that you read about in the textbooks that I honestly didn't think I would come across again in my lifetime. But there it is. It's repeating the same mistakes of the 1980s. How does that end? Badly, of course. But there's a government that continues to cling to power, and it's a government that continues to see Cuba as a key source of support for itself and for maintaining itself in power through Cuban intelligence, through Cuban social services, and following a lot of the principles of the Cuban model that have kept the Cuban regime in power for so long, despite them not having the natural resources or wealth that you saw in Venezuela. So, even though the support is diminishing and it's coming to close to nothing, and Cuba is suffering because of that, because it's adapting to that reality. Not only do you see it with lower economic activity, but you're also seeing it with the balance of payments pressures that Cuba has been experiencing even before the hurricane hit. The balance of payment support, meaning the hard currency that the relationship with Venezuela was generating, was a game changer for them. Now, without it, you are seeing a lot of suppliers not receiving payment in Cuba, longer time to receive payment, and longer time in which they are in arrears, which they're used to, but now the periods are lengthening. So it does seem that the balance of payments pressures are significant for Cuba. And the question is, where to look for now. It seems that they're looking to other sources of aid, such as Russia and China, as David would be able to tell you.
That's exactly where I wanted to go with this, is to talk just a little bit about the balance of payments. I'd like you to comment a little bit on the other exports that Cuba does have. If you could talk a little bit about nickel, sugar, and what's been happening with other exports, including service exports and tourism. But I also wanted to ask you, or just put this question out there, about the balance of payments and regarding difficulties accessing commercial credit. Is this part of the reason that we're seeing a decline in imports on the import side as well? So I just wanted to put that question out there. And then if you could talk about some of the other exports too. I know that oil from Venezuela was also key as far as re-exporting, processing and re-exporting. So if you could talk about the exports a little bit, just for those who may not be familiar with the structure of the Cuban economy and just can hear a little bit more about what they do export.
Sure. I think we should start with a disclaimer that there's not much transparency and there's significant data issues when looking at Cuba's, whether it's balance of payments or economic data. So you do have to get quite a bit into quite a bit of forensics and creative thinking in order to resolve the data deficiencies there. But the fact of the matter is that the main foreign currency earner for Cuba is tourism as a service export. But then, in terms of merchandise exports, you do have other products, as you mentioned, two key products, nickel and sugar, which are their key merchandise exports, in addition to a few others. But the picture has been fluid and changing because, as you said, Melissa, there are no longer re-exports of oil. Venezuela was giving subsidized oil to Cuba more than enough to meet its domestic consumption. And it was a wonderful scheme for Cuba, where they would receive crude oil from Venezuela, more than they needed for their domestic consumption. They would then refine it in that wonderful refinery that they expropriated in the 1960s from an American company, and then re-export the refined products. So not only were they re-exporting crude oil, but now actually refined products, which has a value added. So the inflow of dollars that you were receiving from that was massive, and that, of course, has fallen by the wayside. So once again, you're very much reliant on tourism. You're very much reliant on sugar and nickel. And the sugar and nickel industries have been seeing, a significant decline in prices over the past 4 years. They've been a little bit up and down, sugar particularly in recent years, but in recent months it's been more down than up for both. Cuba's nickel mining operations are one is primarily state-controlled, and another one is a joint venture with a Canadian company. Guess which one is profitable? Certainly the Canadian joint venture is profitable and has relatively low marginal production costs. So it can operate under this low-cost environment. The wholly Cuban-owned one is actually a little bit less profitable and less efficient, so it has trouble operating at these cost levels. So you are seeing, indeed, significant balance of payments pressures because Cuba, as most island economies, does rely quite a bit on merchandise imports of food, of different raw materials, and even capital goods and finished products. But you are seeing these balance of payments pressures that one would have hoped the U.S. tourism story would help alleviate, but it hasn't completely, because the amount of dollars that you actually net from tourism is not as large as from the re-export scheme of oil. You also have to bring in products to serve these tourists, whether they're coming from America or elsewhere. You need to import more food to serve them. You need to import, detergent, bed sheets, all these different types of products to be able to serve them. So the balance of payments pressures are real.
I want to bring David into the discussion here on the point of tourism. I think this is very important. I remember reading in December, I don't have the figure in front of me, but the parliamentary speech, Castro's parliamentary speech in December, I believe that he said it was like 11.9% growth in tourism last year. The number I do have in front of me is that I remember going back and I calculated that half of that growth, half of the increase in tourist arrivals was actually coming from the U.S. U.S. including Cuban Americans. And then we also calculated that 73% of total U.S. arrivals were Cuban Americans, which are just kind of interesting statistics that we found from last year. Now, looking at that and taking that into account, what we're saying that there's been significant growth in tourism. Tourism is what's bringing in hard currency to the economy. David, can you comment about, we've seen changes from the day that the Trump administration came into office. We've seen changes in about every policy, on about every policy front. So talking about Cuba, what's happening, what's happened, what does it mean for tourism? What's the end of the rapprochement? What does that mean for Cuba? Could you just comment on that a little bit, David?
Cuba's actually forecasting approximately 4 million plus visitors this year, which is roughly slightly more than last year. So I don't actually agree necessarily with the statistics you have. One of the problems in understanding tourism statistics in Cuba, as you pointed out, is Cuban Americans are regarded as returning Cubans. But I think the most important thing to say is that Cuba has been rapidly diversifying its market. And the United States, while it was growing significantly last year and will probably decline during the course of this year, my guess is that what you're going to see, although it won't necessarily bring in the same economic value, is increasing number of cruise ship visitors sailing next year, later this year and next year, into ports around Cuba. And I think you have to take into account that the Cubans themselves are continuing to rapidly develop tourism facilities around the country. They're talking to other feeder markets, whether they're in Europe, whether they're Russia, whether they're even China further afield. So the way I see tourism is that there will be a dip this year vis-a-vis the United States, but that the Cubans will be working assiduously in other markets to fill the gap. I think the more important thing that's going to happen is twofold. Firstly, that there's going to be, and there's already signs of this, fall in prices for hotel rooms. Certainly last year, it was almost impossible at some times of year to get a room in Havana. And unfortunately, I suspect the people that are going to suffer the most are some of the small privately owned facilities, the Airbnb facilities, because that's where a lot of the American visitors were actually going to. So I don't see this sort of kind of US-centric analysis as necessarily relevant. And the idea that Cuba's about to enter another special period in peacetime, I think is completely unsupportable, because one of the things the Cubans, I think, have been very good at doing over the years is to diversify their markets. They have certainly been hugely over-reliant on Venezuela for the last few years, but there have been signs for the last year that they've been looking more closely at developing a relationship with Russia, with China, and also particularly with the European Union. And I think the European Union has seen the change of policy in Washington as an extraordinary opportunity to begin to become a major player again in Cuba, which is why a while ago, the European Union signed a political dialogue and cooperation agreement. There have been a number of visits by the commissioner. And one of the things that's very clear to me on the European side of the Atlantic is that a number of European governments, including some that you might not think are particularly likely given their communist background, are rapidly engaging. And one of the things the Cubans have done, which I think is actually very important, is because they were able to reach an agreement with the Paris Club, and because some of that debt is being translated into new investment projects, some countries like the French, the Czechs, for example, are beginning to look at investing and investment opportunities. So what I actually see as happening is that while Cuba clearly wanted an improved, and I think it's very important to stress improved relationship with the United States because their fundamental differences continued, it's diversified its relationship and continues to diversify its relationship. That's not to say that the economic outlook is particularly bright for the year or perhaps 2 years ahead, but I think the most telling thing, which, and I'll stop at this, is that they recently signed what effectively is another barter arrangement with Algeria for oil, and that has a 3-year life. And my guess is that they reckon that within 3 years, they'll be having a different kind of working relationship with Venezuela, because irrespective of what's going on in Venezuela, the Cubans are convinced that this is a long-term relationship.
Okay. So one of the things that Jaime commented on is the balance of payments, and one of the things that we didn't really get into is the investment side, but you did mention that. Can you give us some perspective at all? Where is investment coming from, and where do you expect it will be coming from?
Well, investment in Cuba is extraordinarily difficult wherever you're looking at. But one of the things I've been following quite closely, which I find very interesting, for over a year now, there's been a dialogue going on between Cuba and Russia about a €1 billion investment in upgrading the Cuban railway system. Those talks have been continuing, and the Cubans are saying that sometime this year they hope to sign that off. And it's fundamentally an infrastructural investment that has all sorts of implications, because the idea is that it will link an existing railroad system that runs along the spine of Cuba to key ports like Mariel, Santiago to Cuba, which is in the process of being upgraded. And I think you have to look at the way investment is going rather differently. So the Cubans themselves might be investing as well in, for instance, in hotel construction. But what they're doing is they're talking, for instance, to Mexican and to European management companies to run those hotels, so they get the advantage of the marketing. So it's not a traditional kind of model that we're used to in other parts of the Caribbean, where a foreign investor comes in, does a deal with the government, invests, takes the profits out of the country. And you know, I've spent many years working with companies that have tried to invest in Cuba, and it's not easy, irrespective of who you are or where you come from, whether you're a Russian or whether you're European or a US or Canadian company. Partly because they have different criteria. They're not necessarily working to the same economic criteria unless it's strategic as other countries. I mean, there has to be a social component.
Okay, exactly. Okay. One of the things that you mentioned when you were just talking about the investments was the Port of Santiago. Could you just comment on that project and what changed? Is that going to make any change to trade? What are the impacts that you expect from that project?
Well, it's a very interesting project because most people know about Mariel and the Special Development Zone, which the Cubans have put a lot of emphasis on. But for the last 2 to 3 years, the Chinese have been working with the Cubans to upgrade the Port of Santiago. Because of its physical location, it's quite interesting as a transshipment port because of the routes through to the Panama Canal, out into the rest of the Caribbean and to parts of Latin America. And I think the way the Cubans are thinking about it is that it should become yet another key sort of regional port. Having said that, I mean, you've only got to look around the rest of the Caribbean to see that a lot of people see themselves as potential hubs breaking bulk or alternatively transshipping containers. But it's interesting that this is beginning to emerge at the other end of the island, as it were, to Mariel, and you can see a long-term strategic thinking here. The issue will obviously be is, can they attract the international shipping fleets, and how's it actually going to work practically?
Talking about investment, Jaime, I want to come back to you for just a second. He just told us about some of the different investments, looking at foreign investment, talking about the Cuban government investment and their budget. The budget for 2018, which was approved, it was approved with a fiscal deficit expected at 11.4% of GDP. Jaime, I just wanted you to give us some color around what is that? How does that stand up against other sovereigns? What is 11.4% of GDP? Look like, and from the standpoint of ratings and knowing the credit pressures that you've already discussed, the difficulties accessing foreign currency and whatnot. Could you just comment on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, typically a sovereign deficit of a fiscal deficit of around that level of over 10% of GDP. I mean, only one word comes to mind, which is unsustainable, in the sense that those are crisis level, deficits in any normal sovereign. In fact, in Brazil's case, where we've seen the rating being downgraded significantly, and Brazil being a fallen angel that lost its investment grade status, was because it was sustaining deficit levels of around 10% for a couple of years of GDP. So in any normal economy, this usually spells disaster. But of course, in Cuba's economy, there's a lot of the traditional rules don't apply, as Melissa or David would tell you. There's a lot of different particularities and nuances to this economy, where a lot of that fiscal deficit in the past used to be financed through monetary creation. So in other words, central bank financing. They've shifted away from that, and at some point, in 2014 and 2015, there was talk about financing half of the deficit with monetary creation or monetary emission, and half of the deficit with sovereign bonds. Of course, that would be just to the domestic market. It seems that from what we hear for 2018, that they're going to rely on sovereign bonds issued to the domestic financial system for 100% of that financing. So this way, you're sort of mitigating inflationary pressures within the economy, but indeed, you can't sustain this level of deficits because basically you're simply recycling the amount of liquidity within the economy, taking away from what would be the private sector, but there's very little private sector in Cuba. You're not taking away savings from them. You're basically handing from one pocket of the public sector to another pocket of the public sector. Eventually, that can't carry on forever. But it is necessary, partly because of the reconstruction that you need to undertake from the hurricane damage to large shocks. But we would expect to see this deficit starting to come down a little bit. But as David also mentioned, you need to sustain some level of deficit, because this is an economy that has very, very chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, in everything that you look. Every sovereign, typically you want to have investment as 20% of your GDP as the minimum level, and then above that. Cuba's investment to GDP is around 11%, which is highly deficient, and it doesn't lead to future growth.
Jaime, I've got one last question before I start bringing in the audience for you, and I have one last question for David. Jaime, what would it take to take the outlook on Cuba's rating back from stable to positive?
It's a good question. I think that the process of rapprochement was the large, big hope for moving the rating up once again. But in any case, even if they do find, other trade partners, another way to support their balance of payments, to make good on and clear some of the arrears that they have with suppliers, and, decrease that fiscal deficit and maintain, a little more semblance of order within the economy as they're transitioning away perhaps not entering the special period that they might be entering. I think that one of the things that will always limit the rating is the fact that it seems unlikely that they will be able to issue bonds internationally. They may, as a source of financing and as a source of bringing in new dollars into the economy or foreign currency into the economy, but they face significant risks. There's still expropriated property and foreign claims. There's still many other hidden liabilities that we don't know about. A few of them have been surfacing. David, in one of his publications, spoke about a renegotiation of London club debt following the renegotiation of Paris club debt. A lot of these debts are not even reported in the Cuban statistics. So how many others are there that we don't know about? And this could lead to liabilities, to lawsuits, to a lot of litigation that could block payments to anybody that's interested in actually investing in Cuban foreign debt or in global bonds or sovereign debt if it's issued internationally. So that will always limit the rating to the CAA territory, which is a very highly speculative territory with a certain assumption of that investors will take a loss on their investment.
Okay. I want to, the other big question, I think, for 2018 for Cuba, and there's no one in the world that I'd rather ask this question to than to David. David, could you comment to us, please, about the transition of power? What do you see happening this year?
It's really the most interesting and most challenging question. In April this year, Raul Castro has said that he will step down. On the face of it, it appears that he will be succeeded by Miguel Díaz-Canel. And certainly he has been appearing in most of the Cuban newspapers, meeting and greeting, more recently making some quite important speeches on an historic occasion. But the bit which I find, and I know other Cuba analysts find puzzling, is that it appears that Raul Castro will continue as head of the Communist Party. It's not clear who will take on the role of commander-in-chief of the military, and you appear to have Díaz-Canel probably taking over, as it were, the government. There's also somewhere in the offing new constitutional laws and a new electoral law. And of course, we're in a situation now where we're literally just months away from this handover and not the kind of build-up, as it were, to who is going to take over. So some people might speculate it's going to be delayed. Some people might speculate that there's going to be somebody who quite different emerges, because one of the points that was made to me, and this really I think goes back to some of the points that Jaime was making about the economic crisis that could face Cuba, is who has the respect and authority when the historic generation is no longer there to take the people with them. And I find this the most challenging and fascinating question of all as to exactly what's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball, I can't tell you, but I have also been fascinated to see other names appearing in the Cuban media being built up, making me think that between the conservatives and the centrists and the reformers, that there is actually some kind of contest going on. It's fascinating. It's watch this space. I don't have an answer, but we'll see. Hopefully we'll see in a few months' time.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience. We've gotten some different questions in, and the first question that came in is actually related to the unification of the two currencies. So that's something I'd just like to see if either of you two could, now I'm getting so many questions and I'm losing track of my questions. If either of you could comment on that, any information on when is it going to happen, is it really going to happen, and what exchange rate it's going to happen at?
Well, Raul Castro said fairly recently that it's urgent, it has to take place, but no explanation as to how, when, or why. I do know there are a very significant number of Cuban economists working on trying to find a solution, but more than that, I don't know. But Jaime, perhaps you have a better view.
No, I wish I did, but we've called it the single largest distortion in the Cuban economy, this dual currency system, and we do think it is the most important restriction to having a normally functioning economy. There's always been talk and speculation about this. In 2006, it seemed that they were starting to make strides towards that, which coincides when Raúl Castro took over. It seemed that Raúl Castro does understand that he wants to unwind this dual currency system, whereas perhaps before Raúl Castro, it didn't seem like there was a need from the government or from the Communist Party. But if he is the sole driving force, and he tends to back away, and we've seen this government backtrack significantly on a lot of the measures they take. They started creating and building in 2006 a private sector, then they sometimes back away from it and restrict, and then harass whatever private sector they've developed, and then they try to push a little bit. It's a very paranoid government. So when you're unwinding a distortion of this size, and the traumatic implications that has for the adjustment following that adjustment, that measure, they'll think twice about it continuously, and I don't think that it's going to happen anytime soon.
I got another question that came in that's very closely related, and they're asking about the possible economic effects of the currency reunification. And I've heard David speak before about some of the implications from a balance sheet standpoint, some of the state enterprises, how this works. Is there any information, David, that you could give us on this, on potentially what the economic impacts of this have been or could potentially be?
No, I mean the point that I was making before the webcast began is based on a conversation I've had with one of the UK's leading economists that closely studies Cuba, and she was making the point that one of the big problems in the overall Cuban budget is the gap between the companies that are operating in convertible currency and the ones that are operating in domestic pesos, and how you bring the balance sheet together. And that distorts the overall, or parts of the overall Cuban budget. But one of the extraordinary challenges that, and I'm not an economist, I should stress, is to try and understand how they would intend unifying the two currencies, let alone at what price they would do it. But it's not really much more I can say on the subject.
Okay. David, do you have any information? I've gotten some questions in regarding restrictions and regulations. Are you familiar at all with anything related to restrictions on waste products coming out of Cuba? Do they obey the same types of trade laws that we see with other types of exports?
That's not something I'm
it's too specialist. Okay, that's fine. Okay, in 2017, the government said that they would reestablish a formal framework for a regulated SME sector in Cuba. We've seen recent restrictions on the private sector in Cuba, particularly blocking new licenses for entrepreneurs. What's the outlook for this sector in Cuba? I'll leave it open. Both of you can feel free to respond.
Sorry,
go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I think that, there's certainly scope for growth in the SME sector because it is so small. And we have seen that, what everybody got excited about in terms of investing in Cuba is that, the starting point of where the economy is on its path to development is so low that anything you do, if they decide to transition into more of a mixed model, sort of like the Chinese model or something that's not quite as restrictive as the current model, not only can the profits be made, but there's also a lot of room for growth with a lot of low-hanging fruit, despite the significant, constraints to investment that David has always cautioned about, which are very real. But there is, just opportunity potential, and you have a very well-educated labor force with, highly trained, labor conditions in the market. So there are opportunities there, and you could envisage just naturally a further increase in the SME sector and into more room for the private sector to develop. But as well, you have restrictions, you have regulations, you have the state, which is paranoid about it growing too fast, trying to restrict that growth. It's, you have a racehorse that you're trying to hold back. So at what point does the racehorse, just turn around and bite you? I think that's what they're worried about. But I mean, to go into more details, it has to do with the regulations. It has to do with the state control, at least from my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with that. I mean, one of the perhaps concerning issues literally in the last couple of months has been the number of announcements from different parts of the Cuban government about the introduction of regulations to control the private sector, ranging from incorporation of different groups into trade unions, introduction of different forms of social legislation that apply to the state enterprises, would in future apply to small, medium-sized enterprises and non-state cooperatives. There are efforts being made on the one hand to regulate, and that does have the effect, in my view, of holding back some of the sort of entrepreneurial ability. But on the other hand, you've also got this sort of unusual situation where they are establishing more wholesale markets, because one of the problems if you're a small, let's say, restaurateur, is actually purchasing the inputs at a wholesale price. So there is an understanding that if you're going to have some sort of private sector operating in ways the state no longer wants to, then you have to have wholesale markets, but the process is so slow. And I think, I have the sense, from fairly regularly reading the Cuban media, is that this is one of the 2 or 3 fault lines between the conservatives and the reformers as to how fast or how slow the process should go. And one of the things I often say is anybody that wants to try and understand which way things are going in Cuba is to look at the debate about the role of the internet. Most people talk about the internet as being significant. The United States now has a policy which is aimed at, as it were, the Cubans would say, interfering in their own sovereignty by accessing the internet in different ways. But far more significantly, there's a debate within Cuba as, does the internet exist for Cuban purposes, for history, for culture or education, or does it exist for entertainment and, in theory, external propaganda? And there's an extraordinary debate going on as to how you try to relate these two factors together in a society that says and recognizes that it has to enter the internet age. It's really worth following, because whoever wins that debate, I think, will determine the political future of Cuba.
David, I've got one more question I'm going to direct to you from the audience, and then I'm going to give you both a chance to just give any final remarks. I've gotten a question regarding tourism, and since I know that you not just focus on Cuba, you've also focused on the entire Caribbean basin, could you just comment a little bit about what the increase where you said you expect that tourism may have a lull this year? What could that mean for the rest of the region from the standpoint of tourism? What's the impact in the other islands? Are there any specific islands that you see an impact?
I think the impact will be seen probably in the Eastern Caribbean, because as the US cruise ship companies determine new routings and more of them call at Cuba, which seems to be where the dialogue is going, and sail around Cuba, the probability is that they may reduce the number of calls at Eastern Caribbean destinations. In other words, the ones that are further away from Florida. There's been I think, some short-term indications that after the new US regulations came in on travel to Cuba, a diversion to Jamaica, Bahamas, and one or two other locations. But I suspect these are relatively short-term trends, because if you talk to other Caribbean governments about at the point at which they were concerned as to the impact of the US and US visitors being able to travel freely to Cuba, it was a fairly sort of short-lived effect. And in the end, I think most people recognized that all that was happening was the overall market awareness was growing. And the other key thing in Cuba is you don't necessarily get a lot of repeat business, and that's something the Cubans themselves have recognized.
Okay. All right. Well, we're coming to the end. We had allotted 45 minutes for the webinar, so I want to give you both a chance to just give some final comments before we wrap up. David, if you'd like to go ahead and go first, just what's your overall outlook? What's your overall feeling? What do you want to leave people with as they leave today's webinar?
I think my main thought is the next couple of years for Cuba are going to be difficult from an economic perspective. I don't believe they're going to go back into the dire strait they were in previously in the special period in peacetime. I think the much bigger challenge will be this issue of generational change, how it's managed, and how, more importantly than anything else, whoever emerges and whatever structure emerges is perceived by the Cuban people and particularly by the young.
Jaime, would you go ahead and just give us your final conclusions and sentiments? What do you see coming going forward, and what do you want to leave everyone with today?
Indeed, as David said, it's a challenging few years. I think there was a big bet on the U.S. and that being the catalyst for change within the Cuban economy, not abrupt or quick change like in the transition economies of the 1990s, but sort of like a moderate, managed, China-like slow change. When that fell through, and now with Venezuela in dire straits, it's looking who can support them once again. Is it China? Is it Russia? And it's again going back into old habits, which don't bode too well for progress in terms of making the structural changes that this economy needs to further its path towards development. So it's most likely going to be a disappointing few years unless they can find something new, another catalyst to spur, a change, whether it's intergenerational, as David said, or if it's, some foreign power helping to dictate the fates of Cuba going forward. It doesn't seem like it's a special period, but it's a troubling period, at least until, we see a change, perhaps even in the U.S. administration. Maybe in 3 years, it'll be a different administration and it'll be a different story.
I'd like to just say that while you both agree that there's a challenging period ahead, I think that everyone's very lucky to have heard from the two people that they need to follow over the next few years to find out exactly what's going on with Cuba. So you've heard today, folks, from David Jessop and from Jaime Reusche. When we do put a replay of the video up on YouTube within the next week or so, I'll make sure and put there where you can find their publications online as well, because these are the two people that we look to a lot to get information on Cuba, as well as our independent research. So it's been a pleasure to have you both on the call today. Thank you very much, David, for joining us. Thank you, Jaime. It's time to wrap things up. Thank you all in the audience for joining us today. If you have any feedback on the session, please send it to me at melissa@marladukran.com. We really appreciate you being with us today, and have a fantastic afternoon, everyone. Be well and God bless.